This is episode 15 of the Creator God Theory of the Atonement. I've titled it Creator God Greater Than His Creations, with the subtitle No Need for Any Divine Calculus of Sins, Part 3. Over the last two episodes, we set out to dispel the divine calculus model of the atonement by working through the project in three distinct phases. Phase 1 was recognition. Here we made explicit what was always implicit in the calculus model, the assumption that justice operates through a divine ledger, a system that tracks sinners and sins, assigns values, and calculates an exact penalty that must be paid. Simply recognizing this assumed divine ledger structure completed the first phase. Phase 2 was examination. We then asked whether this divine calculus model could withstand scrutiny. First, we tested it against common sense moral reasoning, our everyday understanding of justice and accountability, and found that it failed even this most basic test. Second, we examined it against a reality-based checklist for theories of the atonement, where it failed again, violating the foundational principles of justice, governing the vicarious nature of the atonement, and collapsing under the weight and incoherence of its infinite claims. Phase 3 is reframing. Here we are no longer examining the calculus model, we are replacing it. This phase unfolds through three assignments. The first assignment was to establish the creator creation greater than principle. The second assignment is to introduce the infinite and eternal nature of that creator God greater than principle. And the third assignment is to apply the fully clarified greater than principle to dispel the divine calculus model. In the last episode, we completed the first assignment, firmly establishing the greater than principle. In this episode, we now turn to the second assignment, introducing the infinite and eternal nature of that creator God greater than principle, so that we are fully prepared to complete the third assignment and show why the divine calculus model collapses altogether. So, let's turn to that second assignment now. In the previous episode, we established the creator God greater than principle at the level of the set of creations. That framework allowed us to explain why the atonement must be greater than any individual creature and why all creature-level solutions ultimately fail. What we did not yet ask was whether that set of creations is closed or open, whether the Creator's redemptive responsibility is sufficient for all creation that has existed and currently exists, or whether it must also extend to all creation that may yet exist. By closed, we mean a set sufficient to account for the past and present scope of creation as it stands. By open, we mean a set that is not finished, one that must remain capable of extending into the future, potentially without limit, as creation itself continues. In this episode, we take the next step. We advance the same creator God greater than principle by introducing the infinite and eternal nature of the atonement, forcing the question of scope, power, and duration, and moving from the set of creations as previously understood to an open set of creations. Not as a change in principle, but as a conceptual advancement. The Creator God is greater than the open set of His creations. This matters because an open creation requires not just broader scope or endless duration, but greater power, and eventually an eternal source. This shift is not a change in principle, but a necessary expansion of it, one that the Book of Mormon itself compels us to make. Rather than asserting that move philosophically or abstractly, we are going to let the Book of Mormon lead the way by allowing three of its prophets to do the work for us. Jacob, King Benjamin, and Amulek each approach the problem from a different angle, and they guide us step by step toward the conclusion this second assignment requires. In doing so, they answer two unavoidable questions. Why must the atonement be infinite and eternal? And why must God Himself accomplish it, rather than a delegated agent representative or substitute? Importantly, none of these prophets set out to teach a formal theory of the atonement. Instead, each one signals a necessary component of the Creator God framework, often in compressed language, often without explanation, but always with remarkable precision. Taken together, these three prophetic witnesses move us precisely where the second assignment requires us to go. Jacob signals why the atonement must be infinite in scope, reach, and power, greater than the problem introduced by the fall. King Benjamin then signals why God himself must atone for his creations and identifies Jesus Christ as the Creator God. And Amulek signals why the atonement must be grounded in an infinite and eternal source. No mere man can do this. Taken together, these prophetic signals show where this analysis is taking us, from a Creator God greater than a fixed set of creations to a Creator God greater than an open set of creations, a framework in which an infinite and eternal atonement is not merely possible, but necessary. With that trajectory now clearly in view, we can turn to the work itself, examining how the prophets signal these truths in their own words. Before turning to these three Book of Mormon prophets, we need to be clear about what we are doing and what we are not doing. We are not attempting to force the Creator God theory onto ancient scripture, nor are we treating the Book of Mormon as a philosophical textbook. Instead, we are paying close attention to a consistent prophetic pattern, how prophets actually speak. Book of Mormon prophets rarely stop to define their terms, argue first principles, defend foundational assumptions. Instead, they speak with compressed intention, assuming shared theological understanding, whether or not their audience is consciously aware of it or fully prepared for it, such as the nature and character of God, God's merciful plan of redemption, creation, fall, and atonement, resurrection and judgment, salvation and damnation, justice and mercy, grace and works. Our task is not to invent new meaning. It is to recover or unpack the meaning stated or already assumed within this prophetic pattern. To do this, we will use a simple but disciplined approach: markers and signals. A marker is a specific phrase the prophet explicitly uses. A textual anchor carrying theological weight, something everyone can see on the page. Markers are textual facts. A signal is what a marker necessarily presupposes or implies, the framework the prophet assumes or points to rather than explains, the underlying theology that makes the marker meaningful. Signals are not speculative additions. They are logical presuppositions and implications. If a marker is a true claim about reality, the signals it carries reveal the background realities that must already exist. Markers are the words used. Signals are the realities those words rely on. Let's now see how this works with a familiar passage from Lehi. With our method now clearly in place, we can see how markers and signals actually work in practice. To do that, we'll use one of the most familiar and frequently quoted statements in the Book of Mormon, a sentence many Latter-day Saints already know well, but may not have slowed down to examine in this way. Adam fell that men might be, and men are, that they might have joy. In this single line from Lehi, we can see how carefully chosen words function as markers, and how those markers quietly signal entire theological frameworks that Lehi assumes rather than explains. Here, we've divided Lehi's statement into two markers. The first is, Adam fell that men might be, and the second is, and men are, that they might have joy. In each case, the marker is simply the quoted text. With that in place, let's turn to the first marker and its signals. This first marker, Adam fell that men might be, addresses existence itself, why humanity exists at all, and it places the fall at the center of that explanation. Lehi is not treating the fall as a mistake, a surprise, or a tragic derailment. He presents it as causally necessary for human existence. When Lehi speaks this way, several theological and historical realities must already be in place, realities that the marker itself quietly signals. The fall presupposes creation. Creation presupposes a creator. Adam is treated as a real person. The fall is treated as a real event. Adam is understood to have participated in that fall. Without the fall, humanity would not exist. Lehi does not argue for any of this. He assumes it, because his statement only makes sense if these realities are already true. Let's now turn to the second marker, where Lehi moves from the fall and existence to their ultimate purpose. And men are, that they might have joy. According to Lehi, humanity does not merely exist. Humanity exists for something. and that something is joy. This signals an ultimate purpose and end, and because Lehi joins existence directly to joy, the statement only functions as a true claim if several underlying realities are already assumed, realities that the marker itself quietly signals, which means, at a minimum, Lehi is already assuming that joy, not sorrow, is the intended end of existence. The fall functions within a larger redemptive plan. The fall and joy are not mutually exclusive. Joy is a moral state of being, not merely a fleeting emotional experience. Once again, Lehi does not pause to explain or defend any of this. He relies on these assumptions and others like them, because without them, the marker itself would not make sense. In a single sentence, Lehi reframes the fall not as the end of hope, but as the necessary beginning of joy. By pairing the fall with joy, he quietly overturns the story of human existence, transforming it from a narrative of loss and condemnation into one of purpose, possibility, and redemption. These are not all the signals present, only some of the most obvious. Lehi relies on far more than he explains. He does not argue these ideas, he assumes them. Jacob, King Benjamin, and Amulek will do the same. As we will soon see, beginning with the Book of Mormon prophet Jacob, this prophetic pattern of markers and signals intensifies, carrying us from the fall directly into the necessity of the atonement. As we move from a simple illustration with Lehi to a more complex passage with Jacob, it helps to make explicit something that has already been happening in the background. When Lehi said, "Adam fell that men might be, and men are that they might have joy," his words were already doing the same work, reaching backward to what must already be true and forward to what necessarily follows. Jacob does the same thing, but with far greater density and consequence. And so before we turn to Jacob's text and its 4 markers, we need to be clear about how this markers and signals method works. When a prophet uses a compressed phrase as a marker, that marker almost always works in 2 directions at the same time. First, it works backward. Backward signals identify what must already be true for the marker to function as a credible claim. These are the presuppositions the prophet relies on and takes for granted, without explicitly acknowledging them. Second, it works forward. Forward signals show what the marker declares outright and what it necessarily implies if it is true. These are the realities and consequences the prophet establishes without fully unpacking. So with most markers, our task is twofold. Look backward to identify what the marker presupposes but does not state, and look forward to identify what the marker declares and what it necessarily implies if it is true. This is why this method matters. Prophets do not speak casually or loosely. They speak with compressed intention, choosing words that do real theological work. Because of that, much is assumed rather than explained. Prophets rely on shared realities, shared frameworks, and shared understanding without stopping to unpack them. And that is why a few carefully chosen words can carry entire theological frameworks. Frameworks that are present in the text even when they are not spelled out. This backward and forward movement is not unique to Jacob, King Benjamin, or Amulek. It is a standard prophetic pattern, and once we learn to see it, we begin to read Scripture very differently. With that method in mind, we can now turn to Jacob. Jacob is not building his argument in a vacuum. He is speaking from within a Creator-God framework that has been working in the background all along, whether explicitly acknowledged or not, and which is well captured by the phrase, "My circus, my monkeys, my problem." So before we turn directly to Jacob's words, let's briefly reestablish that unspoken framework, one we've already developed and relied on in earlier episodes. It begins on one end with eternal realities, leading to a creator, leading to the Godhead, leading to creation, leading to accountability, leading to the fall, leading to the atonement, and ending on the other end with salvation. What we will now do is use this very framework as our working model, not to impose it on the Book of Mormon, but to watch how Book of Mormon prophets themselves assume it, rely on it, and quietly qualify it through their own words. Beginning with Jacob, we will let the prophets do the work for us, showing why the atonement must be infinite, Jacob, revealing who the Creator God is who must perform it, Jesus Christ, King Benjamin, and explaining why the atonement must ultimately be both infinite and eternal. Amulek. So with that Creator God framework in mind, let's begin with 2 Nephi, chapter 9, verses 6 through 9, where Jacob compresses an entire argument into just a few lines. We'll read the passage, visually flag the key markers on screen using numbered brackets, and then apply them to our Creator God framework as our working model. For as death hath passed upon all men, to fulfill the merciful plan of the great Creator, there must needs be a power of resurrection. Wherefore it must needs be an infinite atonement, save it should be an infinite atonement. This corruption could not put on incorruption. If the flesh should rise no more, our spirits must become subject to that angel who fell, to be shut out from the presence of our God. We can reduce Jacob's argument to 4 specific markers. Marker 1, death hath passed upon all men. Marker 2, the merciful plan of the great Creator. Marker 3, a power of resurrection. Marker 4, an infinite atonement. Jacob does not pause to defend these claims. He does not define his terms. He does not argue first principles. Instead, he relies on a series of carefully chosen markers, each of which only makes sense if certain realities are already in place. In the next slides, we'll take these markers one at a time and show what each one signals when applied to our Creator God framework as our working model, beginning with marker 1, and this temporal death that has passed upon all men. Marker 1 appears in verse 6, where Jacob states that death hath passed upon all men. But Jacob himself expands this marker in verse 9 by adding these words, if the flesh should rise no more, our spirits must become subject to that angel who fell, to be shut out from the presence of our God. So, following Jacob's own lead, we will treat these statements together as a single expanded marker. Now recall our method. When a prophet uses a compressed phrase as a marker, that marker almost always works in 2 directions at the same time. Our task, therefore, is twofold. First, we will look backward to identify what this marker presupposes but does not state explicitly. From here on, we'll refer to this as direction 1, backward signals, meaning what the marker presupposes. Second, we will look forward to identify what this marker declares outright and what it necessarily implies. From here on, we'll refer to this as direction 2, forward signals, meaning what the marker declares and implies. With that in mind, we can now begin with direction 1, looking backward at what Jacob's first marker presupposes. We begin by looking backward at what Jacob's first marker signals. When Jacob speaks of death passing upon all men and of being shut out from the presence of God, he is already assuming a fall. And a fall, in turn, presupposes a creation. A creation presupposes a creator. And a creator presupposes accountability, ownership, responsibility, and accountability for what has been created. Jacob does not stop to explain any of this. He relies on it and takes it for granted. Applied to our working model, this is the minimum structure already assumed. Creator points to creation, which implies Creator God accountability, which leads to a fall. We've simply made explicit what Jacob's marker already depends on, or signals. When we place these presuppositions together, creator, creation, accountability, and fall, a single underlying theme comes into view. This is the logic we've been working with all along. My circus, my monkeys, my problem. Creation implies ownership. Ownership implies responsibility. Responsibility implies accountability. And accountability explains why the consequences of the fall do not simply belong to humanity alone. Jacob does not argue this principle, but it is woven through everything he says. And as we now turn to direction 2, forward signals, we'll see that this Creator God accountability is not just a background assumption. It actively shapes what Jacob declares about the problem and what that problem necessarily implies going forward. Having looked backward at what Jacob's first marker presupposes, we now let the text do its forward work. When we speak of forward signals, we are paying attention to 2 things at once: what the marker explicitly declares and what is necessarily implied, if that declaration is true. Some realities Jacob states outright. Others he leaves undeclared, not because they are unimportant, but because they are already assumed. Let's begin with what Jacob directly declares. When Jacob says that death hath passed upon all men, leaving our spirits to be shut out from the presence of our God, he is making a direct claim about the human condition. Death is not selective. It is not partial. It applies to all humanity without exception. And Jacob is not speaking of death in only one sense. He is operating with two dimensions of death, already understood in LDS theology. Temporal death, the separation of body and spirit. Spiritual death, separation from the presence of God. Jacob does not pause to define these categories. He assumes them. He names no exceptions and offers no alternatives. His language allows for none. These are declared realities, plainly stated in the text. From these declarations, several implied but undeclared realities necessarily follow. If temporal death applies to all, then it is universal. If spiritual death applies to all, then it is universal as well. And because Jacob identifies no internal remedy, both conditions are not only universal, but terminal from within the fallen condition itself. Together, these two deaths reveal the true nature of the problem Jacob is exposing. Universal affects all fallen creation. Terminal ends in temporal and spiritual death. Unsolvable from within creation itself. Humanity cannot save itself. Humanity cannot self-rescue. No one can reverse bodily death. No one can restore themselves to God's presence by their own power. What Jacob is signaling here is not merely loss, but dependence. Without intervention from outside the fallen condition, temporal and spiritual death are unavoidable. Only after the scope, reach, and power of this universal and terminal problems are fully exposed does the necessity of the solution come into focus. We can now step back and see what Marker 1 has accomplished. Looking backward, Jacob's language presupposes an entire structure he never explains. A creator, a creation, accountability, and a fall. This is what Marker 1 already assumes in order to function as a meaningful claim. Looking forward, Marker 1 qualifies the fallen state itself. It both declares and implies death, both temporal and spiritual, is universal, terminal, and thus unsolvable from within this fallen state. Humanity cannot self-rescue. Separation from God is unavoidable without intervention. Applied to our working model, Jacob is not introducing anything new. He is clarifying the structure that's been there all along. A creator brings about a creation. Creation establishes accountability. And once the fall occurs within that accountable relationship, Jacob now qualifies it for us, not as partial or temporary, but as universal and terminal. What we've done here is simply make explicit what Jacob's first marker already depends on and quietly signals. At this stage, nothing about the solution has been specified yet. Only the full scope and finality of the problem has been exposed. And that is exactly what prepares us for Jacob's next move, turning from the enormity of the problem to what he calls the merciful plan of the great Creator. This is Jacob's second marker, the merciful plan of the great Creator. An expanded form will appear below it, which we'll draw on later as the implications come into focus. Once again, Jacob does not pause to explain what he means by this phrase. Instead, he assumes his audience is already familiar with the language and teachings of God with a merciful plan. As before, we'll read this marker in two directions, backward to what it presupposes, and forward to what it declares and implies. Let's begin with the backward signals, what this marker presupposes. The first thing to notice is that marker 2 presupposes marker 1. Jacob is not starting a new argument. He is responding to a reality marker 1 has already established. A fall that is universal in that it affects everyone, terminal in that it has permanent consequences, and unsolvable in that it cannot be fixed from inside that fallen condition. Without marker 1, without a fall that is universal, terminal, and unsolvable, the idea of a plan is unnecessary. If there is no real problem to solve, nothing needs to be planned. Outcomes could simply happen without coordination or intervention. For the same reason, the word merciful becomes unintelligible. Mercy only has meaning when there is genuine loss, real consequence, and no way to repair the damage from within without help from outside the fallen condition. Without a fallen condition, mercy would have nothing to respond to. And finally, without marker 1, Calling God great would be merely honorific. It would function as a title rather than a description of what God actually does. Greatness would not be shown through action, but assumed by default. But with marker 1 in place, once the fall is understood as universal, terminal, and unsolvable from within, everything changes. A plan becomes necessary. When there is a real problem that cannot be fixed from inside the fallen condition, outcomes cannot simply be declared. They must be planned for. A plan coordinates a rescue from outside the predicament. Mercy also becomes structural, not sentimental. Mercy is no longer just compassion or kindness. It becomes the organized means by which rescue is actually carried out within reality. Mercy now does real work. And God's greatness becomes functional. It is no longer a title or assumption, but a demonstrated capacity, the ability to carry out the plan in all its details. The fact that marker 2 presupposes marker 1 is crucial to everything that follows. But what follows is not merely another step in Jacob's argument for an infinite atonement. It marks a genuinely groundbreaking shift in how the Book of Mormon, and Latter-day Saint theology more broadly, understands the relationship between God, humanity, and reality itself. By introducing the merciful plan of the great Creator, marker 2 already presupposes a plan constrained by reality itself. This marks a quiet but profound shift in how Latter-day Saint theology understands the relationship between God, humanity, and reality itself. Whether Jacob consciously reflected on all of these implications is beside the point. His language already assumes them. And that same language of God having a merciful enacted plan permeates the Book of Mormon, appearing repeatedly as the plan of salvation, plan of redemption, plan of deliverance, plan of mercy, the great plan of happiness, and similar expressions throughout the record. A plan is not a decree. It assumes structure, constraint, and fixed realities that must be worked within. Jacob does not pause to explain this assumption, but his language cannot avoid it. And once noticed, it reshapes how we understand both the nature of salvation and the nature of God. The reason this matters is that Latter-day Saints are so accustomed to speaking in this language of God having a plan that we rarely stop to consider what the word itself commits us to. Yet the moment salvation depends on a plan, certain things must already be true, both about the nature of reality itself and about the nature of the God for whom a plan is necessary. To see what Jacob's language already assumes, we will examine these implications one at a time. First, what a plan presupposes about reality, and then what a plan presupposes about God. We begin with what a plan presupposes about reality. First, a plan presupposes constraints. Plans only exist where outcomes cannot simply be willed into existence. If something can be wished or decreed away, no plan is required. Second, a plan presupposes fixed eternal realities, conditions that must be worked with rather than overridden. A plan coordinates action with what is, not with what one might prefer reality to be. Third, a plan presupposes the absoluteness of reality itself, not the absolutism of divine decrees. Reality sets the terms. The plan must fit reality, not the other way around. Once this is seen, certain things about God are quietly assumed as well, which takes us to what a plan presupposes about God. Jacob's language presupposes a God who operates within eternal realities, rather than above them, what we might call God inside the box. God works from within the structure of reality, not by suspending it at will. This also means that God's will is not absolute. Absolutism belongs to reality itself, to eternal law, justice, agency, and consequence, not to divine will. And finally, God's merciful plan must adhere to eternal law in order to succeed. God's greatness is not expressed by overriding reality, but by abiding by it and bringing salvation about in a way that actually works, what we have referred to as abide and abound. Jacob does not spell any of this out, but he cannot avoid presupposing it. And once we see what the word plan already commits us to, we begin to understand why the atonement is not optional or a matter of divine preference, but a necessity grounded in reality itself. The very shift that makes mercy meaningful, justice unavoidable, the atonement necessary, and salvation costly. Taken together, marker 2 sends two backward signals that significantly advance our working model. First, marker 2 presupposes marker 1. Jacob's appeal to a merciful plan only makes sense because a prior reality is already in place, a fall that is universal and terminal. In our working model, this establishes the full causal chain of creator leading to creation, leading to creator-God accountability, leading to the fall, and qualifies that fall as being both universal and terminal. The problem is not partial, local, or temporary. It cannot be resolved from within the fallen condition itself. Marker 2 does not restate this problem. It assumes it and builds upon it. Second, marker 2 presupposes a plan constrained by reality. By introducing a plan at all, Jacob signals that salvation cannot be achieved by declaration alone. A plan implies fixed conditions, structured constraints, and eternal realities that must be worked with rather than overridden. In the working model, this means that eternal realities are absolute, and any solution, including the atonement, must operate within them. When these two presuppositions are taken together, they move the model forward in a decisive way. A universal and terminal fall establishes the problem. A plan constrained by eternal reality establishes the terms of the solution, and together they point to a deeper metaphysical conclusion: the absolutism of reality and the primacy of existence, as against the traditional Christian emphasis on the absolutism of God and the primacy of consciousness. And it is precisely this deeper metaphysical conclusion that marks a genuinely groundbreaking shift in how the Book of Mormon, and Latter-day Saint theology more broadly, understands the relationship between God, humanity, and reality itself, all drawn from the quiet but decisive presupposition embedded in a single familiar teaching, that God has a plan. As you can see, this analytical approach to the Book of Mormon prophets, tracking their markers, presuppositions, and implications, is powerful, but it also takes time. We've reached a natural stopping point for this episode. In the next installment, we'll return briefly to Jacob's marker 2, and then turn to King Benjamin and Amulek to complete this trio of witnesses testifying to the necessity of an infinite and eternal atonement. With that, we now move into part 4 of this series, titled Creator God Greater Than His Creations, with the subtitle, No Need for Any Divine Calculus of Sins,